Hi all, Rick here, covering the lore from the massive Terran flagship of the Mirror Universe, the Imperial Palace away from Terra, the projected throne of the Dominus, the ISS Charon, the one of a kind. It's pretty cool in the fact that it's basically one of the only purely Mirror Universe starships we've ever seen from the human-centric Empire. So this is basically what they think is awesome when they're not stealing Starfleet designs. In real life, the ship was designed by John Eves, based on the brief for a planet-threatening doomsday weapon, with a palace on it. He took the original series Doomsday Planet Killer as an inspiration, and envisioned it as if skeletal, analogizing a whale's skeleton as the inspiration reflecting on the scale of the ship. The idea for a visible power core was added by Tamara Deverill, before the notion of the mycelium reactor was folded into the show, and in fact inspired that element. With the scale of the vessel, architectural references were used for informing the buildings atop the ship, looking at a brutalist style to create an imposing utilitarian look. So, the ISS Charon was launched from the Imperial shipyards of Epsilon Indy 4 in 2255. Although there was a very similar design present in the 2220s, this may have been the same ship minus the reactor, or a prototype, or an oversight. But I doubt the Section 31 film would ever include something like that. Anyway, designed from the start to be the flagship for the Empire, it is a unique vessel in terms of power generation, form and function. The core of the vessel was created by the Terran scientist Paul Stamets, based on his research into the mycelial plane of subspace. Unlike the Prime Timeline Stamets, who used it to make a redacted drive on the USS Redacted, the Mirror Universe Stamets saw its potential as a fuel source. The reactor tapped into the mycelial plane and basically burned it up, using the highly energized particles of Prototaxites Stellaviatori to tap into the realm and siphon the energy to power this massive flagship. The roiling core gave off numerous radiations, magnetic fields and gravitational waves, which made it very easy to detect, even from extreme distances. Much of the detrimental radiation was pumped back into the subspace layers, destroying it further. A large majority of the workings of this reactor were responsible for the bulk of the ship, and the mycelial sun, as it was known, was visible in the centre of the vessel, held within a containment field. Despite being a destructive, finite resource, it did provide incredible power, and that's all the Terrans cared about, until they started learning of its potential to maybe travel to other dimensions too. Fortunately, they did not get that far with their research. As it was to function as an imperial palace, the ship held numerous staterooms, theatre halls, banquet chambers, and many such areas for hosting guests. The throne room itself could function as a backup control room, though there was a separate bridge. Of course, it being the Terran Empire, many corridors were also lined with additional security measures, force fields and phaser turrets. The ship also contained dungeons and torture units in the form of antagonizer booths. From its scale, it was able to contain something for almost every function, from laboratories to facilities to direct and run the Empire. The Charon was to act as the mobile base for the Emperor when they personally wished to visit other systems and directly impose their will. Not every Terran Emperor had this mindset of personally wanting to take to the field, but the vessel's commissioner, Philippa Georgiou, very much enjoyed directly exerting her influence. Therefore, the ship had to be able to continue the running of the Empire. Now, the Charon operated on a dedicated M18 central computer. The M series, like the Prime version, was based on brain scans of actual people. However, the Charon's AI structure was based off of anyone who used its transporters, their pattern being retained and used to inform the networking of the vessel. This means that sometimes, with a myriad of minds, the computer would respond with different voices, even personality, which gave it an eerie edge, suitable for the name. It was a staggering 9.6 kilometres long, although it's hard to pin down exactly how large, with some estimates putting it over this and others finding it closer to 6. Either way, it truly lives up to the estimation of being a city-sized starship and is basically a mobile station. It could house up to 200,000 personnel, but it's not clear if this was actually crew or simply the maximum. As it was, it travelled with 10 battalions of Imperial soldiers, each battalion consisting of 1,000 people. It had 450 decks, which seems rather high, even for its scale, so I'm going to assume some of these decks were labelled for different parts of the ship, rather than sequentially layered. Now, it did also house several functional warp cores that were based in the nacelles. Usually I'd say there was not enough room, but that's not an issue here. However, its main power source was from the mycelial tech, and it's likely these cores served as a backup as well as the infrastructure to house the warp reaction. It had 4 nacelles to cover its sheer volume, 2 primary ones on the flanks and 2 at the rear, with a maximum speed of warp 9.6 on the old scale. It had no capacity for spore drive travel. It featured 12 impulse engines across the vessel, which could accelerate it to 0.75 the speed of light. There were 2 large Bussard collectors for interstellar material collection. In terms of armaments, it had a lot. It had 120 phaser turrets lining the flanks of the vessel, a further 18 phaser arrays lining various points around the front, each capable of dual firing. There was 1 rear-facing large ball-mounted phaser cannon, and 32 photon torpedo launchers, divided up into 16 front and 16 rear-facing. It carried enough firepower to level a planet's surface, and render it devoid of life over a matter of hours through orbital bombardment, sundering a planet's crust entirely. There were 2 hangars, 1 fore and 1 rear-facing, that could house numerous auxiliary ships and were reported to contain numerous fighter craft. Supporting this were a myriad of docking bays along the spine and keel of the ship, on each facing side. It's really difficult to judge the scale of the ship through schematics and screenshots, but it is truly massive. Such a size could only be maintained through the use of the reactor, otherwise it lacked power enough to maintain itself. There is a reason starships usually did not get this large. It must also have incredibly powerful structural integrity fields. Now, in subsequent licensed but non-canon works, the ISS Charon's destruction resulted in its debris falling into the mycelial plane and being scattered across numerous dimensions and timelines nearby, along with some heavily shaken up survivors. A second vessel was constructed based on the Charon's collected tech. This one named the Styx, and featured many of the same technologies. However, it was only a fraction of the size, as its reactor did not work to consume the mycelial plane for energy, instead using a more benign siphoning. There was even a later 25th century version created for the mirror universe of the online timeline that acted as the flagship of the Terran Emperor, Wesley Crusher, of the 25th century, which I may cover separately. Thanks for watching this breakdown on the Imperial throne ship of the Terran Empire. It's truly a ridiculous vessel that blows the socks off most other ships we see, and one that thankfully was destroyed, a gaudy, golden, short-sighted and overzealous display of power, and one that would have consumed an entire ecosystem to power itself, until it ran out of gas. And then what? But that's kind of the point of this ship. The Terran Empire didn't care. Thanks for watching. I've been Rick, and until the next one, goodbye.